Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome once again. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Valley Beth Shalom Torah Study online. It's Shabbos morning, and we're delighted to have you with us. This morning, we're joined by my dear friend, Rabbi Marc Gellman from the far reaches of wild Florida, and we welcome back to our midst Rabbi Sherre Hirsch of the American Jewish University. Sherre, welcome back.
I'm so happy to be back. I missed both of you and I missed all of our listeners.
So people, as many times as I tried to reassure people that you were just taking some needed vacation time from your very busy schedule, everyone was very worried. So I'm sure they're glad to see your face this morning.
And I'm completely fine. Thank you so much all for your concerns, your emails, your love, your notes. I'm completely fine. I just needed a little bit of 5 children at home and lots of work at AJU. It was just piling up. So thank you for giving me that bit of respite as well.
It's great to have you back. So this week we open up Parsha Toldot. We take a step beyond the Abraham stories and we move into the next generations of the patriarchal narratives with the birth of Isaac and Esau at the beginning of the story, the trading of the birthright, as it were, in the middle of the story. And then the most famous part of the story is the purloining or the stealing of the blessing at the end of the story. And as you read this story, you've got to grimace a little bit and wonder what the authors or editors of the Torah had in mind when they gave us these kinds of narratives. When I take pictures of my kids and put them into photo albums, I throw out the ones where the kid is cross-eyed or sticking a tongue out. But our ancestors in some ways wanted to include narratives that were painfully unattractive and showed family problems. This is a deeply dysfunctional family. In fact, once I did a program at the synagogue where I invited 3 therapists to talk about this family. As I imagine, I want you, these 4 people sitting in front of you, Isaac and Rebecca, Jacob and Esau, they're sitting in your office. Discuss for me what your therapeutic strategy would be if you were trying to stitch this family back together. The question is why? What is the Torah trying to teach about families, about covenant, about the presence of God in the world as we read these stories? Sherre, we welcome you back. Why don't you begin?
So I'm always struck in the story about how the Torah shows the favoritism that Rebecca has for Isaac and that Rebecca has for Jacob and that Isaac has for Esau. I'm struck by that because the first rule of thumb is you love your children equally and there are no favorites. And I think there's a very important message in this narration, which is that this idea of favoritism is true for every single parent. And we don't use that word because it's a bad word. But the truth is that some of our children we have more compatibility with, and some of our children we have less compatibility with. And if you think about it, Rebecca had much more compatibility with Jacob, and Isaac had much more compatibility with Esau. And so when you say, Eddie, why would the Torah air its dirty laundry? I think it's trying to recognize and acknowledge and name for us that it is normal, in fact, it is human, to have children that you have more compatibility with. And so to stop beating ourselves up with, oh my God, I don't play favorites. I don't play favorites. I love all my children equally. We love our children differently. And some of them are easier to love and some of them are harder to love. And when I share that with other parents, you can see an audible sigh of relief because just like we have some friends who are easier to be friends with and some friends who are harder to be friends with, so too it's with our children. And I love that disclosure that the Torah is telling us right off the bat to give us a sense of our own humanity.
You've just offered absolution to every parent in the world who feels guilty that I feel more sympathetic to one and I'm harder on the other one. But let me ask you the question then that follows from the Torah reading, which is, okay, so if I know that about myself, if I know that I'm easier on this one, or I resonate to this one, or we share more than with that one, then what do I do in the family to prevent the kind of rivalries and destructive violence that this Torah portion describes, that issues from this sense that mom loves me best or dad loves me best?
Are you asking me? Or you want to ask
Yeah,
Marc?
I want to ask you.
Oh, good. Thank you. I just didn't want to I want to make sure Marc had a chance.
I never worry
I
about
have nothing to say about this. Nothing.
Gellman will find
Zero.
time.
You have nothing to say about this, Marc? You never
Well, maybe a word or two, maybe.
Maybe. So I think the challenge is that we want each of our children to walk away thinking they are the favorite and that there is no singular favorite. And the way that I encourage parents to work on that is not what Isaac and Rebecca did. In fact, it's the favorite in my eyes for who you are, not for the reincarnation or the display of how much you're like me, right? Most parents have compatibility with the ones that are most like them or the opposite. And so we want our children to actualize and confirm that we're so great. But if we can let go of that and embrace their uniqueness, then they're favorite because they're the favorite in their own eyes and in the eyes of God, which is much harder to do.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think a piece of it is the fact that there's certain similarities and compatibilities that are the result of a sexist culture. You know, I can't tell you the number of brisses I was at where the father was just over the moon in joy. And I was so happy. You have a son. He said, yeah, I got someone to throw the ball with. I can play catch with him. I can throw the football and do stuff with him. And, you know, the men I know from my generation and certainly from my parents' generation, they weren't that good on showing emotional support for daughters and for sons who weren't like them. There's a natural way that you gravitate toward children who do what you do. The lesson that I take from this sibling rivalry, and I completely agree with Sherry's really brilliant analysis of it, is that we have to work to love, to disconnect love from achievement. That's the root of all of this favoritism. That, oh, what grade did you get on that test? Well, I got an A. Oh, great! I love you. I love you. I love you. I'm so proud of you. But what if you fail the test? So you don't love me now? Is that the deal? And it's very interesting. There have been studies done that kids who have been praised for achievement end up being cheaters to a far greater level than children who are praised for effort. Just, I was happy you tried your best. And they then tried, the test, they gave a test to kids and they said, you have a choice from an easy test or a hard test. And the kids who chose the hard test turned out not to be cheaters because they wanted to struggle and strive. Whereas the kids who took the easy test were ones in which accomplishment, achievement, success were connected to love. And that's one of the most spiritually and psychologically corrosive mistakes we make as parents. And I think that's also behind what the Torah is trying to teach us.
I want to take, I really appreciate this, but I want to take the story another level up, because I certainly think you're right, that it's talking about the family dynamic and how one grows up in a family with siblings that are different than us and how one gains parental love. But I think that the Torah is doing something else. Sigmund Freud put forth the idea that the central dynamic of human development, and by extension, the central dynamic of human drama, of human history, is our relationship with our parents. He wasn't so good with women, but with men, he posited this thing called the Oedipal complex, where a little boy falls in love with mommy. And when he realizes that he can't overcome daddy, he identifies with daddy. And that's where he gains a sense of masculine identity. And what happens in the Oedipal complex is that the infantile sexuality, the pleasure drive, comes into contact with reality, the reality principle, and that's the ultimate driver for sublimation, which is the creation of culture. That was Sigmund Freud's theory in a nutshell. The Bible has a different idea. The Bible posits the idea, or at least the book of Genesis posits the idea, that the principal driver of human development and human drama is our relationship to our siblings. So the book of Genesis and then Exodus is organized a series of 7 brothers stories. You have Cain and Abel, the sons of Noah, Abraham and Lot, his brother's dead, but his brother's son is still there, Isaac and Ishmael, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and his brothers, and then Moses. And then Moses has 2 very interesting brothers. He has Aaron, with whom he has a very subtle rivalry, and he has Pharaoh, who is ultimately his stepbrother, with whom he has an overt rivalry. And I think that what the Bible is trying to do in this situation, in all of these narratives, is to demonstrate what happens when 2 brothers are competing for the attention of the father. And in this case, I think it's writ large. I mean, this story is the most blatant of all the stories. It's 2 brothers fighting for one blessing. 2 brothers, one blessing. And the question that I'm left with as I read this narrative, and every year it comes around and I just want to yell. I yell a lot at the Torah, but I yell at this story, is who told Father Isaac he only had one blessing? Who told Father Isaac that you have 2 kids, and instead of loving them differently, but loving them on a similar level, that one has to be above the other, that this is a hierarchical arrangement instead of an inclusive love relationship. And it occurs to me 3 things, 3 implications of this. Number one, that there were moments in Jewish history, in the Bible itself, when the kingdom split after King David and King Solomon, when the Jewish people splits. And the question is, how do you treat your brother? And that this is a story about how you treat your brother. And more than that, number 2, and this is where I think it gets very deep, this is a critique of a structural flaw in monotheism. This structural flaw in monotheism. There are 2 ways to read monotheism. One is an inclusive monotheism, and the other is an exclusive monotheism. An inclusive monotheism says one God, there's room for everybody. God is everyone's creator, or father in that case, our Father who art in heaven. And that you read monotheism as a statement of universality, universalism. The other is an exclusive monotheism, where you say, we are the children of that God, and you're not. You are the children of a lesser God, to use a phrase. You are someone else. You belong to some other family. You are not of the blessed. And there you end up with a monotheism that impels a division within humanity. And here I think the Bible is saying something very profound, because at the end of the story, the family explodes. Jacob is going to run away to Mesopotamia to save his life. Esau has promised to kill him. Rebecca realizes that she set her sons against each other, so that they're both doomed in that sense. And Isaac, I mean, what kind of relationship does Isaac and Rebecca have after this? The family is doomed. And the Torah is trying to say that if you embrace an exclusive monotheism, we're doomed. It's just too small a planet to say we belong and you don't. We're blessed and you're not. Yeah. And the third way, hang on one second. The third way, the third level of this is an extension of that, which is every time that we tend to think in binary terms, us and them, winners and losers, the people who belong and the people who don't belong. This story comes back and says, really? Is that really what you want to do? Is that really the way that you think you're going to survive in this world? You're going to prosper in this world by stepping over your brother? You really think that's the way to do it? So I read this as a very deep and angry and in some ways desperate narrative to try to change the way that we think about our deepest impulses and our deep religious life.
Well, I actually agree completely with you, but then you have a big question to answer, and that is, what sense do you make of the chosen people? What sense do you make of that? That God is almost explicitly refuting the idea of a universal monotheism. But So I'd like to hear your answer to that.
Well, first of all, the question is asked over and over again. I mean, I take great comfort in the fact that as much as we like to say our pride in who we are, in the Midrash and in the Talmudic sources, and as well as in the medieval and the modern sources, that question is asked again and again. And the motivation for even asking the question is a basic discomfort with the idea. I mean, the Midrash that has this, when the people of Israel cross the Red Sea and they start singing and dancing at the death of Pharaoh, and that's in the Torah. The Midrash then superimposes a higher level of morality and says, when the angels in heaven started dancing, God says, shut up, my children are drowning in the sea, you don't celebrate. Now that Midrash comes from a notion that, yeah, they may be the chosen ones, but that doesn't negate the place, the centrality, the importance of and the value of every human soul in the world. And I find that over and over again in the tradition. And so the tradition itself is very ambivalent about this idea of walking around calling yourself a chosen person. To me, the notion of chosenness, I mean, the way that I read it is as a moral chosenness, meaning not that we're better, superior, better looking, richer, more popular. We like that, but we're not. This is a moral obligation. I carry a sense of moral obligation, and it's an open-ended moral obligation. There are allies outside of my ethnic circle who join us in the task of bringing tikkun to the world.
That's great. I completely agree. I think that's a good response. And let me add 2 bits of support for it. You don't need to go to the rabbis, although eventually they make that case. How about Amos, who says, look, you're like the Ethiopians to me. You're like the Philistines. I took them out of Kaftor and Kir. And so God, through the prophets, is saying, look, I am the savior of all peoples, from all Egypts, from all oppressions. And that's the first point. The second is that there's a kind of really deep universalism in this parsha, which includes several references, 3 precisely actually, of the sands of the sea and the stars of the sky, and I'm going to make you numerous and numerous and numerous. And obviously that hasn't happened. God didn't make us as numerous as any sands on any beach and any stars in any sky. That didn't happen. And even though our high point in world population was in the Roman period, where 10% of the Roman Empire was Jewish, right now, we're nothing. We're barely 2% of America and under 1% of the world. So if you ask yourself, did God welch on the covenant? Did God deny the promise that God had made to make us numerous? The answer is yes, absolutely God did, if you look at an exclusive monotheism. But if you look at it as Jews and Christians and Muslims, all of whom were nurtured from the same revelation, and you say, wait a minute, with all of them included, half the world believes that God revealed God's will through the Torah, and they populate the world. 1 out of every 3 people on earth is a Christian. There's 2 billion Catholics. There's 1.6 billion Muslims. So I think if you look at the way the Torah describes the promise of multitudes, that promise was never fulfilled through Jews, but it was fulfilled through those who learned from us, who traced their origins to us, and that is also a universalistic teaching. So I'm with you on the universalistic teaching completely.
You opened my eyes to something I have never seen before. This is why I love Torah learning, because there's always a new window, which is that we didn't stand a chance of not forming a society in which we played favorites, in which we had hierarchy, because the systemic thorough line through our entire history is God selecting this person, Abraham, Noah, this person, this blessing. Because the question I keep asking myself is, Rebecca could have changed the narrative. She could have said, there's so many blessings to go around. Don't even worry about it. We love you so much. But she had no precedent for that. She had no understanding of that because she'd only been modeled in Judaism that you are selected, you are the one that's in, and you are the one that's out. And that started us off on a very, behind the starting line. And it's interesting to me because I've never seen that. And it makes me very sad because now we've been spending years and years of playing catch up to get to this place where it's like, wait, we're not in scarcity, we're in abundance, right? We're not in scarcity, we're in abundance, but we didn't start from there. So of course it is like a flipping of our entire thought systems. And I never saw that until you just taught that. So thank you.
Right. The difference between an economy of scarcity where you grasp for everything that you need or want, and an economy of abundance where you can sit back and share with as an open hand, changes everything in the human drama. And I think that even within the story itself, not just the denouement, the end of the story, which is destructive and disastrous, family exploding in front of our eyes, but within the story itself, because as you read the story, it's one of the great narratives. And for everyone watching, if you haven't read it, get a Chumash, get a good, well-translated Chumash, and read it. What a story. If you love storytelling, it's a great story. The manipulative mother, the morally tepid young man, the dense older brother, and it's just a great story. And he goes in, Isaac is sitting in the tent in the dark, and Jacob brings the meal that Rebecca has cooked, and he has Esau's clothes on and the skins of the animals on his hands. And Isaac, the first thing Isaac says is who are you? Which of my sons are you? And so right in know, something's not right. And he knows. And the question is, what does Isaac know, and when does he know it? To ask, Woodward and Bernstein's question.
If he believed in abundance, because clearly he knew that it wasn't Esau from the moment.
If not from the very first moment, as he keeps going through the drama, you get that sense.
Right. Question after question. And you wonder, to what degree could have Isaac said, look, I got another blessing in my back pocket?
Because there is something there. And here's what's there. He says to him, and out of wonderment, the voice is the voice of Jacob, but the hands are the hands of Esau. And I think that's the blessing. I think what he's trying to say to him is, son, you're a twin. Twins in mythology is a split human being. You have half of the humanity you're going to need. You have the cleverness, you have the manipulation, you have the linguistic skills, but you don't have your brother's ability to act in the world with boldness, with courage, and with strength. So you need his hands tied to your voice, and he doesn't have your brains, and he doesn't have your ability to see what's happening around him. He's impulsive, he's physicality, right? It's the two of you are half a person. If you put the two halves together, you'd have a whole person. That's the blessing. That's the blessing. That's what Father Isaac is trying to say to him.
So I have a question for both of you, which addresses what I think is one of the serious flaws in the story, or open questions, I would rather say. And that is, Isaac knew that God had more than one blessing because his half-brother Ishmael got a blessing and he got a blessing. There were two blessings. And in fact, it was Abraham's inability to believe in both those blessings which caused the necessity for the Akedah, as we talked about when we discussed that. So why were there two blessings for Isaac and Ishmael, but only one blessing for Jacob and Esau?
But Eddie's saying that actually Isaac had another blessing. It's that Jacob didn't recognize it as a blessing. So in fact, there were two blessings. It's just that Jacob didn't know that that was his blessing. Isn't that what you're saying, Eddie? And to me, that's even more telling, because that means that there's blessings that we don't name as blessings, but they are definitely for us. And that is the democratizing of that love is much more abundant. We just don't see them having the same value as the first blessing.
And Ishmael is kicked out of the house. And the idea that you have two brothers and one is embraced and the other is thrown out of the house, basically to die in the desert, is a terrifying, terrifying precedent. And the interesting thing, by the way, at the end of the story, which I think is so interesting, you start this story, you start this parsha, you read the story about the stew, the soup, the lentils, the adom adom. You know, Esau comes in from the field, Jacob is cooking, right? That tells you who they are right away, right? And he says, what are you making? You know, and he says, I'm hungry, I'm famished, I'll sell you anything, I'll give you my birthright, which you can't really sell a birthright, but he plays this game for, and he sells him the birthright. And Esau takes the bowl of food, and there's 5 verbs in a row without a break. Vayakom, he takes it and he eats it, and you have this sense of a boor. He's a barbarian, right? He's all drive and impulse and no reflection. By the end of the story, you feel sorry for him. When he comes back from the field and serves his father the meal, and they sit together, and the father says, I gave him the blessing. And Esau begins to cry, and he says, have you but one blessing? Have you no blessing for me? And suddenly this big barbarian, in the Yiddish is a bulvan, this big boor of a man, wrestles animals to the ground. He's a little boy. He's a little boy who only wants his father's approval. And when his brother steals the father's approval, you start to feel sorry for the kid. And there's a midrash, which is spectacular, which is the Messiah will not come and the world will not be redeemed until Esau runs out of tears, until you've played out that drama and the rage and the pain that we put into that spirit, blaming us that we stole the birthright. We stole the blessing. Until his rage and pain is played out, the world will not be redeemed. It's such a brutal end of the story.
We did steal the blessing. That's the point. And Esau didn't get a second blessing. There was one blessing, and it was stolen by Esau. Esau at the behest of his mother. So it's just a horrible story. It's a horrible story. And this idea of the scarcity of blessings in just one generation, when there were 2 blessings for Isaac and Ishmael, makes no sense to me. Makes no sense, except this tradition, which I think the Torah sadly is honoring. Sadly. And that was the tradition that Esau was the progenitor of all the enemies of Israel. That Esau was eventually, and the rabbis really developed this enormously, Esau was Rome. And later even that Esau was Hitler and Esau was Khmelnytsky and Esau was all of our persecutors. So it isn't only that he didn't get a blessing, it's that this guy was the progenitor of all anti-Semites for all time. Now that's our problem, and we own that problem. The problem I see in the Christian tradition is there is only one way to the Father, and that is through me, John 14:7. The idea that for Christianity there is an exclusivist monotheism that requires belief in the salvific death and resurrection of Jesus. Without that, you're gone. And Islam, there's no access to God. And Islam followed the Christian move in that regard. So even though we are the ones who invented this disparity and this awful exclusivist monotheism, which I think is a beautiful phrase you use, that even so, in the end, it's Judaism that has the most universalistic monotheism because of its development of the B'nai Noach laws, that tzadikei ha'omot ha'olam yesh lehem chelek be'olam haba. There is that the righteous of all nations will have a share in the world to come. So ultimately, in the end, we become the universalists. And the people who follow us and the trunks that are grafted onto the branches that are grafted onto our trunk of the tree, they're the ones who are in our time fighting for religious domination of the world.
I'm just curious, Marc, you spend an awful lot of time with Father Tom.
Yeah.
You're very, very, very dear, your brother, your dear friend. And did you ever discuss this with him? How did he read that verse? Or Sherre, you've done some interfaith work. When you speak to and I have too, spent with very sensitive Christians. I'm just curious how they read that verse and how they look at us.
Well, it's funny. My teacher of Torah, Sam Sandmill, may his memory be blessed, he taught us once in class, it's not that there aren't bad verses in the Torah. It's not that there aren't bad verses in the New Testament. The question that needs to be asked is, why would you quote those verses when there's other verses that are better and more universalistic and more loving? So that was the way it was with Tommy and with me. We never spoke about whether Jesus was God. We never, ever spoke about whether belief in Jesus was required. He thought I was saved through Jesus because of Ronner's idea of anonymous Christians, and that one way or another, Jesus' death saved me. And we didn't talk about it. What we talked about were the things we agreed with each other, and where were the commonalities between Christianity and Judaism. And our mission statement for the God Squad, which I believe ought to be the mission statement for America right now in these times, our mission statement was, we know enough about how we're all different, and we don't know enough yet about how we're all the same.
I just paused for a second because that phrasing is so beautiful, Marc. Thank you for sharing it with us. I haven't done enough interfaith work to really understand how Christians would interpret that verse. But what I'm struck by more than anything is our need, or I would say the rabbi's need, to demonize Esau. Once he didn't get the blessing, there was as Marc referred to, a historical, literally whipping of him and making him out forever to be the perennial metaphor of all bad things to Jews, which is so painful, because you can just imagine this soul, and how he's described in the beginning of the story as sort of like this, nice guy who's a huntsman, who's stocky and likes a good bowl of soup, and just, and so why we need to demonize him, why we need to perpetuate that demonization. And now, as we begin to look at what that's about, is a more interesting question to me, or one of the questions I wrestle with.
Yeah, I mean, part of it is the, Jung had this idea that each of us has a shadow. It's the parts of us we don't want to look at. And Esau might represent the parts of us, of our own character we don't want to look at.
But
Marc,
really,
yes.
Isaac's blind following of Rebecca and his manipulation is also shadows of things that we don't want to look at ourselves.
That's
right.
Yeah. Well, that's and we inherited that.
Right. And there's a lot of Isaac's personalities that I think are dark shadows.
There's a lot of junk there. I once I was visiting a church once as a guest speaker, and somebody quoted that verse, Marc, the only through me shall you come to the Father. And the pastor happened to be listening to the conversation, and the pastor stood up and had a wonderful talk. He said to the Sunday school class that I was teaching, visiting, he said, that was said to us, not to him. He pointed to me and he said, he has a covenant. He has the covenant of Abraham. He had as a way to God. It's all the rest of us. It's all the rest of us who came from other families of the earth who didn't have a way to God. And when Jesus said that, he said that to us. That's our covenant. Jesus is our covenant, and he has the covenant of Torah. And I went and gave the guy a hug, because I thought that was such a lovely way of interpreting. And there too, the impulse behind it was, as you said, recognize what we share. Recognize what binds us together instead of what splits us apart. That's the only way that you're going to save the world.
Also, so this, so beautiful.
Yes, isn't it? So this coming week, we're going to celebrate Thanksgiving. And I hate to repeat the phrase that we've heard so many times, but it's an unprecedented Thanksgiving. Under normal circumstances, we would get up early and watch the parade in New York. Apparently, they're going to have the parade, but without anybody there, which is such an interesting symbol of a broken time. Um, and then we would have the whole family and friends gathered together and celebrate the feast of Thanksgiving, which is America's most sacred moment. Um, and instead, we'll do this in smaller groups. Maybe we'll see each other on Zoom, but we won't be able to be at the same table sharing the same blessings and bounty. So let me just ask you as we finish together, um, what blessing you're going to say for the folks at your table and the folks who aren't at your table for this Thanksgiving. What blessings do we have to embrace? What Dvar Torah, what words of Torah do we need to give to the people who come to our table and to the people who are, alas, not able to be at our table this year for Thanksgiving dinner?
Marc, you're going to go first?
Marc, why don't you go first? Marc seems to be frozen.
Oh, I think he may have frozen. So before I even say what thanks I'm going to give on Thanksgiving, I do have to say I'm married to a Southerner and he fries a turkey. So my first thanks is to this greasy fried turkey that is so delicious that I love this holiday more than I could ever imagine. Although my vegan kids do not. So I just have to say that. But the blessing that I see is that this will have a time when we reflect on it as a period of time. Like this was the season of COVID, whether it's 18 months or 20 months, but it will have a beginning, a middle, and end where we say, this was the season of COVID. And what I want to be able to say when we're looking at hindsight is during that season, I was deeply grateful for the things that mattered, right? Like I took my children and I didn't become a warden of how much digital time they were on the computer. And I didn't become a wife that was nagging her husband, but that I took that moment to say, that time is like no other. And so I elevated it. And I want to be able to say that when we look back on this season. So I'm grateful for the moments and the awareness that I'm thinking about the end and how I want to reflect on it. Did we lose Marc altogether?
I hope he comes back, but I think we've lost Rabbi Gellman for the moment.
Tell me what you'll say.
I appreciate that very much. I keep thinking about, we're born into the world as human individuals. We walk around encased in a physical existence which is separate from everybody else's. And the Torah represents in the very first chapters this idea of lo tov heot adam levado. You shouldn't be left alone. And that we spend our lifetimes trying to reach across our boundaries to connect with each other in love, to build families, to build relationships, to connect with each other in learning, to build chevra, to build a learning relationship, to connect with each other as we construct the world. And it's a struggle. It's always a struggle connecting with others. And what COVID has done is forced us to be physically separate. But maybe it's also taught us the precious value of being connected, the precious value of being together. Because as we sit at the table and feel the loss of the table full of friends, the loss of the house full of children, the loss of the grandparents who can't be with us because it's just too damn dangerous. Maybe that will teach us once and for all, or at least for the next iteration of our existence, to remember always just how precious and how cherished these relationships, these connections with us are, and give us the values that it takes: forgiveness and patience, humility, listening, to realize what we mean to each other and what we are to each other, and how much we are invested in each other. So let's wish Rabbi Gellman wherever he is, and
we lost him,
your family, and all of those who are sharing not only good Shabbos this week, but a sweet and a healthy and a thankful Thanksgiving. Following this broadcast, of course, at 10 o'clock we have Shabbos morning services. We celebrate a lovely bat mitzvah here at VBS. At 11:30, our friend Hillel Silverman, Rabbi Hillel Silverman, our great teacher, will offer us his thoughts on this parsha. And then this evening, Havdalah at 6 o'clock. I want to wish everyone a really wonderful Shabbat and a great Thanksgiving, and stay well. Thanks, Sherry.
Thank you, Eddie.